6:43 a.m. The first warning. I woke up to the blaring of my phone vibrating violently against the nightstand. The buzzing was relentless, each vibration echoing like a hammer in my skull. My body was drenched in sweat, and my throat felt like sandpaper. I grabbed the phone, squinting against the blinding blue light. Emergency alert. Airborne contamination detected. Stay indoors. Close all ventilation. Wear filtration masks if exposed. Await further instructions. What the hell? I mumbled, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up, the stale air in my apartment feeling heavier than usual. I rubbed my eyes, hoping I was still caught in a nightmare, but the sharp vibration of another alert shattered that hope. Emergency alert. Airborne threat confirmed. Avoid outdoor exposure. This was a drill. I flipped on the TV, my fingers fumbling for the remote as the screen came alive. The anchorwoman on the news looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes bloodshot, and her expression was hollow. Government officials are urging citizens to stay indoors. Reports indicate a viral mutation has shifted transmission methods. Authorities believe the infection is now airborne, making previous containment measures ineffective. Repeat, the virus is now airborne. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the humid air. My mind struggled to process the words. Airborne? That wasn't possible. The virus, what little we knew about it, had been transmitted through bodily fluids and direct contact. But airborne? That changed everything. 6:51 a.m. Ethan's call. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Ethan, my younger brother, Alex. His voice was ragged, almost frantic. Ethan, where are you? I asked, my pulse quickening. I'm still in Chicago, he said, his voice cracking. They locked down the city last night. No one's getting in or out. Jesus, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Why the hell didn't you leave earlier? I tried, he snapped, coughing violently into the receiver. The highways were packed. They closed the exits before I could make it out. A pit formed in my stomach. Chicago was one of the first cities where the outbreak had spread uncontrollably. If the virus was airborne now, Ethan was already in the danger zone. Ethan, listen to me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you have any masks? Anything to filter the air? Yeah, but they're the cheap kind. He coughed again, a deep, wet sound that made my blood run cold. I glanced at the emergency alert on my screen again. Close all ventilation. Wear filtration masks if exposed. Seal your windows, I instructed. Use duct tape if you have to. Cover the vents. Do whatever you can to keep the air out. Alex, Ethan's voice trembled. I don't think it's just the air. I froze. What do you mean? There's something else, he whispered, his voice barely audible. People are changing faster. It's not just infection anymore. It's like they don't even need to breathe it in. My mouth went dry. That didn't make sense. Airborne viruses followed predictable patterns: transmission, incubation, mutation, but this sounded like something beyond anything we'd ever encountered. Stay where you are, I said, trying to hide the fear in my voice. I'm coming to get you. Alex, don't. The line went dead. 7:04 a.m. Rationalizing the impossible. I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand as the silence stretched. My heart hammered against my ribcage, my mind racing to make sense of the chaos. People are changing faster. That's what Ethan had said. But how? The mutation had shifted to airborne, but this was more than a mutation. It was evolving. I pulled out my laptop, my hands trembling as I searched for any updates. News outlets were flooded with reports of mass hysteria. Videos of people collapsing in the streets, blood pouring from their noses and ears, filled my screen. Authorities are investigating reports that the infection may no longer require direct exposure. Symptoms include violent coughing, extreme aggression, and cognitive deterioration within hours of exposure. Cognitive deterioration, I whispered, my pulse pounding in my ears. The infection wasn't just airborne. It was accelerating neural decay. Whatever was happening, it was transforming people at an unprecedented rate. 7:12 a.m. panic in the streets. I moved to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek outside. The city was unrecognizable. People ran in every direction, some wearing masks, others clutching makeshift filters over their mouths. Sirens wailed in the distance. A man collapsed on the sidewalk below, convulsing violently before going eerily still. A woman screamed, backing away from the lifeless body. But then, he moved. His body twitched unnaturally, like a puppet being jerked by invisible strings. Slowly, he stood up, his movements jerky, his head snapping toward the nearest person. And then he ran. He wasn't alive. Not anymore. Oh God. I whispered, stepping back from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. 7:20 a.m., preparing for the worst. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I had to get out. I had to get to Ethan before it was too late. I grabbed my go bag, something I had prepared months ago when the first outbreaks began, and started packing essentials. Gas mask, bottled water, first aid kit, emergency radio. I threw on my jacket and slung the bag over my shoulder. You can do this, I told myself, trying to steady my breathing. But a sickening feeling gnawed at the back of my mind. If the virus was airborne, no amount of preparation would be enough. 7:33 a.m., leaving the apartment. I reached the front door, my hand hovering over the lock. Once I opened that door, there was no turning back. The air outside was no longer safe, and every breath could be my last. Get to Ethan. Save Ethan. That was all that mattered. I took a deep breath, adjusted my mask, and unlocked the door. The hallway was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. I stepped out, my footsteps echoing against the cold, sterile walls. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Survive. Get to Ethan. As I moved toward the stairwell, I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing from the shadows. I wasn't alone. 7:35 a.m. into the unknown. I froze. My hand tightened around the strap of my go bag, my knuckles turning white. The sound echoed down the dim hallway, low, guttural, and wrong. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Don't panic. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body stayed rooted to the spot. I forced myself to take one step forward, then another. The growling sound grew fainter, but the sense of being watched lingered. Just get to the stairs. Don't think. Don't stop. The stairwell door was only a few feet away now. I pushed it open, the metal creaking louder than I'd hoped. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped inside, the dim light barely illuminating the concrete steps spiraling downward. I started down, taking each step as quietly as possible. My breathing was shallow, my mask pressed tightly against my face. I wasn't sure how effective it would be, but it was the only thing standing between me and whatever was in the air. Halfway down the stairs, I heard it again, a shuffle, closer. I froze mid-step. The sound echoed from above, but I didn't dare look back. Whatever was up there, it was moving, and it was moving fast. Don't look, just go. I descended the remaining steps 2 at a time, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound grew fainter the farther I went, but I didn't stop until I reached the bottom. I pushed through the door leading to the parking garage and slammed it shut behind me. 7:42 a.m., city in chaos. The parking garage was eerily quiet, but I could hear the chaos outside. Distant screams, sirens, gunfire. It's happening faster than anyone predicted. I ducked behind a concrete pillar and peered out toward the street. The city was a war zone. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, some still running. Smoke billowed from buildings. People were running, not away from something, but from everything. And the infected, they were everywhere. I spotted a man stumbling toward a group of panicked civilians. He looked normal at first glance. No visible wounds, no obvious signs of infection. But then he collapsed to his knees, convulsing violently. His body spasmed, contorting unnaturally before he went still. For a moment, everything was silent. Then he moved. His head snapped up, and his eyes were gone, replaced by a milky, lifeless glaze. His mouth opened unnaturally wide as he let out an unearthly screech and lunged at the nearest person. The others didn't have a chance. The infected moved faster than I'd ever seen before. They didn't shamble like the zombies in movies. They sprinted, and they were hungry. I ducked back behind the pillar, my breathing ragged. Get to the airport. Get to Ethan. I had no choice. I couldn't stay here. 7:55 a.m. The drive of terror. I found my car tucked away in a corner of the garage. I slid inside, locking the doors out of instinct, even though I knew a thin sheet of glass wouldn't protect me. The air was heavy, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. I pulled up the GPS on my phone. O'Hare International Airport, 28 minutes away. Just get to the airport. I started the engine, the low hum of the motor feeling unnervingly loud in the silence. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. But nothing came. As I pulled out onto the street, the reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. The city was gone. People were either dead or running for their lives. Cars were piled up at intersections. Bodies littered the sidewalks, and the air was thick with smoke. I kept my mask on, but the paranoia gnawed at the back of my mind. Is this even enough? What if it's already in the car? What if I'm breathing in right now? I forced the thoughts away and focused on the road. I weaved through the chaos, narrowly avoiding collisions as panicked drivers slammed into each other. I kept my speed steady, avoiding sudden stops that might attract unwanted attention. But the infected, they were everywhere. A woman darted into the street ahead of me, waving frantically. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt and blood. "Help me," she screamed. My foot hovered over the brake. "Don't stop. You can't help her." The infected were close behind her. 3 of them. I didn't have a choice. I swerved around her, my tires screeching as I narrowly avoided hitting her. I didn't look back. I'm sorry. 8:20 a.m. Gridlock at the airport. By the time I reached O'Hare, it was clear I was too late. The roads leading to the airport were a nightmare. Cars were packed bumper to bumper, horns blaring as desperate people tried to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The main gates were blocked by military barricades. Soldiers stood at the perimeter, weapons drawn, shouting at civilians to stay back. I pulled off the road, parking behind an abandoned van. I couldn't risk getting caught in that crowd. I needed another way in. Think, Alex. Think. My eyes scanned the perimeter. There had to be another entrance. A cargo gate, a service road, something. Then I saw it, a maintenance entrance on the far side of the airport, guarded by only a few soldiers. It was my best shot. I grabbed my bag and slipped out of the car, keeping low as I moved toward the fence. The air felt heavier now, and my breathing was shallow despite the mask. Don't think about it. Just keep moving. 8:33 a.m. The price of survival. I was halfway to the fence when I heard it. A distant scream. I turned just in time to see a wave of infected breaking through the barricade. The soldiers fired, but it wasn't enough. The infected tore through the crowd, ripping into anyone in their path. Blood splattered the pavement, and the air was filled with the sounds of chaos. I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted toward the maintenance gate, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them behind me. The screeches, the pounding of feet on asphalt. The gate was just ahead. A soldier spotted me and raised his rifle. "Stop. Stay where you are. Don't shoot." I gasped, raising my hands. "Are you infected?" he demanded, his finger hovering over the trigger. "No, I'm clean," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the chaos. He hesitated, then motioned for me to get down. "Come on," he barked, pulling me through the gate and slamming it shut behind me. 8:45 a.m. A glimpse of the truth. I collapsed against the fence, gasping for air. The soldier knelt beside me, his eyes scanning me for any sign of infection. "You're lucky," he muttered, lowering his weapon. "Most don't make it this far." "Thanks," I panted, pulling off my mask for a moment to catch my breath. "Don't." His voice was sharp, his eyes narrowing. I froze. "Don't take that off," he said, his tone deadly serious. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I adjusted the mask back over my face. "Is it really in the air?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The soldier's eyes darkened. "It's worse than that," he said, his voice low. "It's not just the air." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just looked out at the chaos beyond the fence. And that's when I saw it. A figure in the distance. Not infected. Not human. Something else. 8:47 a.m. The figure in the distance. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stood motionless beyond the fence, just on the edge of the chaos. Tall, unmoving. At first, I thought it was another soldier, maybe a straggler left behind in the panic. But something was off. The posture, too rigid. The head tilted slightly, almost observing, and then it moved. Not with the jerky, frenzied speed of the infected. This was different. Precise. Measured. What the hell? I mutter, my breath fogging up the inside of my mask. "Don't stare at it." The soldier's voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. "Look away," he warned, his grip tightening on his rifle. "What is that?" I asked, forcing myself to avert my gaze. "Not your concern," he muttered, his eyes still locked on the figure. "Just keep moving." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't infected. So what was it? 8:50 a.m. Inside the perimeter. The soldier led me deeper into the secure zone, away from the chaos outside. The air was thick with tension, the smell of smoke and burning flesh lingering even through the mask. Rows of makeshift tents lined the tarmac. People, survivors, huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. "Stay close," the soldier said, his voice low. "We're not safe yet. Where are we going?" I asked, my eyes scanning the area. "To someone who can help," he replied. We weaved through the crowd, but something felt wrong. The people looked dazed, their movements sluggish. A woman coughed violently into her hand, her eyes glazed over. Their breathing it in, panic gripped my chest. I tightened my mask, pulling the straps so tight that it hurt. "They're already infected, aren't they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The soldier didn't answer. 8:55 a.m. Dr. Julia Voss. We stopped outside a reinforced tent marked with a biohazard symbol. Two armed guards flanked the entrance, their faces hidden behind gas masks. "She's inside," the soldier said, gesturing toward the tent. "Who is Dr. Julia Voss?" My heart skipped a beat. I'd heard the name before. Julia Voss was one of the top virologists at the CDC. If anyone had answers, it was her. I stepped inside the tent, and the smell of antiseptic burned my nostrils. The air was heavy, almost suffocating despite the filtration system humming in the background. Dr. Voss stood over a table cluttered with vials, test tubes, and hastily scrawled notes. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her eyes were bloodshot, but her movements were precise, controlled chaos. "Dr. Voss?" I asked, my voice hesitant. She didn't look up. "Who let you in?" she muttered, her focus locked on a vial of blood she was examining under a microscope. "The soldier outside," I said. "He said you could help." "Help?" She scoffed, finally turning to face me. "I can't even help myself." Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something I hadn't expected: fear. "You're Alex Carter, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked. "How do you know my name?" "Your research." She gestured toward a stack of papers on the table. "I've been following your work on viral mutations. You were one of the first to suggest that the virus could adapt beyond physical contact." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Then you know," I whispered. She nodded slowly. "The virus, it's not just airborne." 9:03 a.m. Evolution beyond comprehension. "Then what is it?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Dr. Voss sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "It's evolving," she said softly, "faster than anything we've ever seen. The airborne strain is only part of the problem." I leaned in, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Explain." She pointed to a series of brain scans displayed on a nearby monitor. The images showed something disturbing. "The virus is targeting the nervous system," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's rewriting neural pathways, changing how the brain processes stimuli." I stared at the scans, my stomach twisting into knots. "Neural decay?" I asked. Worse. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw raw terror. It's adapting to override higher brain function, she said, turning hosts into something else. And not just the infected. I felt the blood drain from my face. Wait, what do you mean not just the infected? Dr. Voss hesitated, her jaw tightening. Sleepers. My mind struggled to process the word. What the hell are sleepers? 9:15 a.m. The silent threat. Dr. Voss gestured toward another monitor, this one displaying thermal scans of the quarantine zones. You've seen the infected, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there's another group. The images showed clusters of heat signatures, people scattered throughout the zones. But some of them weren't moving. They look normal, I said, squinting at the screen. They are normal, she replied. For now, my stomach clenched. The virus isn't just turning people into mindless monsters, Dr. Voss said. It's creating dormant carriers. Dormant, I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. They don't show symptoms, she explained, her expression grim. No fever, no coughing, nothing. But the virus is there waiting. It lies dormant until it's triggered. Triggered, my mind raced, trying to piece it together. What triggers it? I asked, my voice tight. Dr. Voss's expression darkened. Stress, fear, adrenaline, anything that spikes neural activity. My stomach dropped. Oh my God. The moment their bodies perceive danger, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They turn. 9:27 a.m. hidden among us. A sickening realization washed over me. The people outside, I murmured, my eyes widening. Sleepers, Dr. Voss confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. They're everywhere. My mind reeled. If the virus had spread this far, and if people were walking around as ticking time bombs, there's no way to stop it, I whispered. There might be, she said, but her tone lacked conviction. I glanced at her, hope flickering for a brief moment. But we need a sample, she added, her voice heavy with dread. A sample of what? Patient 0, she said softly. The original strain. Before it mutated, my pulse pounded in my ears. Do you know where it is? Dr. Voss nodded slowly. Chicago, she whispered. My heart stopped. Ethan, 9:45 a.m. The message. A sudden burst of static echoed from the emergency radio on the table. All units, report to Sector 9 immediately. Hostiles detected within the perimeter. Dr. Voss's eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew we didn't have much time. We have to go, I said, grabbing my bag. Dr. Voss hesitated, her eyes flicking back to the monitors. Julia, I urged. She took a deep breath and nodded. But as we turned to leave, the emergency broadcast cut in again. New threat detected. Airborne mutation confirmed in secondary zones. All personnel are advised to remain undercover. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Secondary zones? Dr. Voss's expression hardened. The virus is spreading beyond the quarantine zones, she whispered. And if it reaches the secondary zones, civilization is over. I finished, my throat dry. The air around us felt heavier. We weren't safe. Not anymore. 9:50 a.m. No safe zones left. Secondary zones. The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. If the virus had breached the secondary zones, the infection was no longer confined to major urban centers. It was spreading into rural areas, places where containment was nearly impossible. We're running out of time, I muttered, adjusting the straps of my go bag. Dr. Voss's face was pale, her eyes flicking toward the monitors as more heat signatures appeared along the perimeter. They're getting closer, she murmured. I followed her gaze. The infected were converging on the perimeter, but something was different. They weren't mindless. They were organized. That's not normal, I thought, a chill running down my spine. Come on, I whispered, pulling her toward the exit. We need to move. 9:55 a.m. Evacuation plans. The air outside was thick with tension. The distant sound of gunfire echoed through the air, but it was sporadic now, shorter bursts, less organized. The soldiers were losing ground. We need to get to a secure transport, I said, scanning the area. Forget the transports, Dr. Voss muttered, her eyes narrowing as she pointed to a row of military Humvees parked near the far edge of the camp. "Those are sealed," she said. "Armored. We can make it to Chicago." Chicago. My mind snapped back to Ethan. "I'm coming, Ethan. Just hold on. Let's go," I said, keeping low as we weaved between the tents. Survivors huddled together, their eyes hollow with fear. Some of them, I froze mid-step, their eyes glazed over, too still. "Alex," Dr. Voss whispered, her hand tightening on my arm. "They're sleepers," I whispered. 9:58 a.m., ticking time bombs. We moved carefully, avoiding the clusters of dormant carriers. They looked normal, no signs of infection. But I remembered Dr. Voss's words. Stress, fear, adrenaline, anything that spikes neural activity. "Don't make a sound," I reminded myself. A man sat nearby, rocking back and forth, whispering to himself. His eyes were vacant, his lips moving silently, as if reciting a prayer. "Please don't let him turn." Dr. Voss motioned toward the Humvees. "Almost there," she whispered. We were only 20 feet away when it happened. A distant explosion. The ground shook beneath us, and the sudden shockwave triggered something primal in the sleeper nearby. His head snapped up, his vacant eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, he screamed. 10:01 a.m. All hell breaks loose. The scream echoed through the camp like a siren, and it was followed by an avalanche of chaos. The other sleepers woke up. One by one, they turned, mouths stretched unnaturally wide, eyes going blank and lifeless. They moved faster than I could react. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Dr. Voss's arm and pulling her toward the Humvees. The first sleeper lunged, his body contorting unnaturally as he sprinted toward us. I barely had time to duck as he crashed into the tent beside me, tearing through the fabric with inhuman strength. "Faster, Alex," Dr. Voss stumbled, her foot catching on a stray cable. "Get up," I shouted, yanking her back to her feet. But the sleepers were closing in, dozens of them. They didn't move like the infected. They were coordinated, focused. They were hunting. 10:05 a.m., securing the Humvee. We reached the Humvee, my fingers fumbling with the door handle. Come on," I muttered, my heart pounding in my ears. The door swung open, and I shoved Dr. Voss inside before climbing in after her. "Lock it," she gasped, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the controls. I slammed the door shut and engaged the locks. The heavy thud of fists pounding against the armored glass echoed around us almost immediately. Too close. The Humvee's engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, plowing through the chaos as the infected threw themselves at the vehicle. "Where's the exit?" I asked, my eyes darting to the GPS. "West perimeter," Dr. Voss said, her voice strained. "Got it." The tires screeched as I maneuvered the Humvee through the debris, the reinforced frame holding up against the onslaught. But the infected weren't giving up. They were learning. 10:10 a.m. Adaptation and control. "They're getting smarter," Dr. Voss murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The infected weren't just chasing us. They were coordinating. Some of them were flanking us, cutting off possible escape routes. Others were using debris to slow us down. "They're adapting," I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel. This shouldn't be possible," Dr. Voss whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "It's not just a virus," I said, my voice barely audible. "It's something else. Neural adaptation," she whispered, her mind racing. "It's not just rewriting neural pathways, it's connecting them." "Connecting?" I echoed, my mind struggling to keep up. "They're communicating," she said softly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Telepathic?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not exactly," she said, "but they're linked. A hive mind." My stomach dropped. "If they're linked," I murmured, "then killing one won't stop them," she finished, her voice trembling. 10:15 a.m., roadblock ahead. We rounded a corner, and my heart stopped. A makeshift barricade blocked the road. Overturned cars, debris, and bodies piled high. "Shit," I swerved, barely managing to avoid slamming into the wreckage. "We can't stop," Dr. Voss warned, her voice tight. "I know," I growled, scanning for another route. But the infected were closing in. I spotted an alley to the left, narrow but passable. Hold on, I shouted, yanking the wheel hard. The Humvee lurched, the tires screeching as I barreled down the alley. The walls so close I could hear the scrape of metal against concrete. Where does this lead? Dr. Voss asked, her voice strained. Hopefully somewhere that isn't crawling with infected, I muttered. 10:18 a.m. New intel. The emergency radio crackled to life again. Sector 9 compromised. Repeat, Sector 9 compromised. Sector 9, Dr. Voss's eyes widened. That's where the secondary zone boundary was. My stomach clenched. Secondary zone's gone, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The infection was spreading beyond containment. Alex, Dr. Voss said, her voice trembling. I glanced at her, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected: resignation. If we don't find patient 0, she trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. We will, I said, forcing conviction into my tone. We have to. 10:25 a.m. The silent threat returns. The alley opened up into a deserted industrial zone. Warehouses lined the street, their doors hanging open, the interiors dark and foreboding. This is bad, I muttered, slowing the Humvee. Dr. Voss checked the GPS. We're close, she murmured. Less than 5 miles to the quarantine site. I was about to respond when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the street. Tall, unmoving, the same figure I'd seen at the perimeter. Alex, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice laced with fear. I see it, I murmured, my hands tightening on the wheel. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching us. Drive, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. I floored the gas, but as we sped toward the figure, it vanished. What the hell was that? Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely audible. Yeah, whatever that was, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's not human. 10:30 a.m., Chicago or bust. The road stretched out ahead, but the weight in my chest grew heavier. Chicago was close, but so was whatever was watching us. And I had this sinking feeling. It was waiting. 10:35 a.m., racing toward Chicago. The Humvee roared down the cracked highway, the city skyline looming ahead like a dying beast. Smoke curled into the sky, dark plumes stretching across the horizon. 5 miles, Dr. Voss murmured, her eyes glued to the GPS. Feels like 500, I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The infected weren't far behind. I could see them in the rearview mirror, a mass of frenzied bodies moving unervingly fast. They're gaining, I said through gritted teeth. Dr. Voss's fingers tapped furiously on the tablet she'd rigged to the Humvee's console. Trying to ping the CDC, she muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. Any luck? I asked, swerving to avoid an abandoned car in the middle of the road. Nothing yet, she replied, frustration evident in her tone. Comms are still down, but if we can reach Chicago, if we both knew the odds. Chicago wasn't just a city anymore. It was a war zone, and we were driving straight into the heart of it. 10:40 a.m., the Hive's influence. They're too coordinated, I said, stealing another glance at the infected trailing us. Because they're not acting individually, Dr. Voss replied, her tone grim. The Hive mind, I murmured. She nodded. They're sharing information, learning, adapting. My stomach churned. That means they know where we're going. Exactly. Then why aren't they cutting us off? Dr. Voss's expression darkened. Because they don't need to, she said softly. A chill ran down my spine. They're hurting us. 10:45 a.m., roadblock ahead. Shit. I slammed the brakes, the Humvee screeching to a halt. Another barricade. This one was more deliberate. Abandoned cars, debris, and bodies piled high. But the formation was too precise, too calculated. They set this up, I muttered, my knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. Dr. Voss's eyes scanned the barricade, her mind racing. There's no way through, she murmured. Maybe not. I glanced for a narrow side street to the left. Hang on. I cranked the wheel hard, the Humvee skidding as I veered off the main road. 10:47 a.m., back alleys and dead ends. The alley was tight, barely wide enough for the Humvee. We're cutting it close, Dr. Voss warned, her eyes flicking nervously to the sides. Better than sitting ducks on the main road, I muttered. The infected swarmed behind us, but the narrow passage slowed them down. For now, where does this lead? Dr. Voss asked, checking the map. Industrial sector, I replied. Cuts around to the west side of the city. Good, she murmured, but my gut told me it wouldn't stay good for long. 10:50 a.m., Chicago's edge. We emerged from the alley onto a deserted stretch of road. Chicago was closer now, too close, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Fires burned uncontrollably. Smoke choked the sky. The city was gone. Jesus, I whispered. Dr. Voss didn't respond. She was too focused on the distant CDC quarantine site. There, she said, pointing. A fortified compound sat on the outskirts of the city, its perimeter lined with barbed wire and military vehicles. Looks intact, I said, a flicker of hope stirring in my chest. Let's hope it stays that way, Dr. Voss muttered. 10:55 a.m., hostile territory. As we approached the compound, the radio crackled to life. Identify yourself. My heart skipped a beat. Finally, I muttered, grabbing the receiver. This is Alex Carter, I said. I'm with Dr. Julia Voss. We're inbound with critical intel on the Airborne strain. There was a brief pause. Carter? From Project Genesis. Yeah, I replied, surprised they knew who I was. Proceed to Gate 3. Do not deviate. Understood, I said, steering toward the designated entry point. But something felt off. Why didn't they ask for a security code? Dr. Voss murmured, her brow furrowed. I didn't like it either. Stay alert, I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel. 10:58 a.m., entering the compound. Gate 3 loomed ahead, reinforced, guarded by soldiers in full hazmat gear. But they weren't moving. Why aren't they waving us in? Dr. Voss asked, her voice tight with unease. Something's wrong, I muttered. I slowed the Humvee, my eyes scanning the area. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. I followed her gaze. One of the soldiers. His movements were too stiff, too mechanical. Oh no, I slammed the brakes just as the soldier turned, his eyes vacant, lifeless. They're infected, I whispered. 11 a.m. Ambush. The soldiers at the gate weren't soldiers anymore. They were sleepers. But worse, they were armed. Drive, Dr. Voss shouted. I floored the gas, but it was too late. Gunfire erupted around us, bullets pinging off the reinforced plating of the Humvee. Shit, I swerved, tried to avoid the hail of bullets. They're not aiming to kill us, Dr. Voss murmured, her voice laced with fear. What? They're trying to disable the vehicle. They're thinking. The hive mind wasn't just adapting. It was strategizing. 11:05 a.m. The mind of the hive. We can't let them take us, I muttered, gripping the wheel as the Humvee careened toward the inner compound. Dr. Voss's eyes widened as she realized what I was about to do. Alex, wait, hold on. I slammed the accelerator, ramming through the gate. Metal groaned and buckled as the Humvee plowed through the barrier, sending debris flying. But we were in. For now, 11:10 a.m., inside the compound. The interior of the compound was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Where is everyone? Dr. Voss murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Dead, I replied grimly, my eyes scanning the area. Or worse. Let's move, I said, grabbing my rifle and stepping out of the Humvee. Dr. Voss followed, her steps hesitant but determined. The lab's this way, she said, leading me toward the central building. But as we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. 11:15 a.m., Patient Zero's trail. Inside the building, the air was thick with the stench of decay. Bodies littered the hallways. Soldiers, scientists, civilians. But something was wrong. The bodies, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice trembling. I knelt beside one of the corpses, my eyes narrowing. No signs of trauma, I murmured. No bites, no scratches. Dr. Voss's face went pale. The airborne strain, she whispered. It killed them before they could turn. 11:20 a.m., the lab. We reached the lab. Rows of containment units lined the walls, some still intact, others shattered. Where's the sample? I asked, scanning the area. Over here, Dr. Voss murmured, her eyes locking onto a sealed containment chamber. Inside, a vial, glowing faintly. Patient Zero, she whispered. But as she reached for it, the lights flickered, and I felt it, a presence, watching. We're not alone. 11:25 a.m., the observer returns. My blood ran cold as I turned. The figure, the one I'd seen before, it stood at the far end of the lab, silent, unmoving. But this time, I felt something. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. "Alex," Dr. Voss's voice trembled. "Yeah," I whispered, my heart pounding in my ears. "I think it knows." 11:30 a.m. The hive's true power. The figure didn't move, but I felt the air around us shift. It's not just controlling the infected. My mind raced. It's controlling us. 11:31 a.m. Face to face with the unknown. The figure stood at the far end of the lab, unmoving, watching. But this wasn't like before. Before, it had been a fleeting glimpse, a shadow in the distance. Now, it was here. I gripped my rifle tighter, my heart pounding in my ears. "Alex," Dr. Voss's voice trembled beside me. "I see it," I murmured, not taking my eyes off the figure. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were elongated, almost unnaturally thin, and its head tilted slightly, as if studying us. No eyes, no mouth, but I felt its gaze. "Is it infected?" I whispered, my finger hovering over the trigger. Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. "No," she murmured. I glanced at her, confusion flooding my mind. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the figure, but her expression, she looked like she was listening. 11:33 a.m. A silent voice. "Julia," I whispered, my tone more urgent. She didn't respond. Her eyes glazed over, her body going rigid. "Hey," I grabbed her arm, shaking her slightly. She blinked, as if coming out of a trance. "Alex," her voice was barely above a whisper. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, scanning the area. I don't know." She shook her head, her face pale. "It was talking to me. Talking, not with words," she murmured, her voice shaky. "It was in my head." My blood turned cold. "The hive," I whispered. She nodded slowly. "It's not just controlling them." Her voice trembled as her eyes met mine. "It's trying to control us." 11:35 a.m. The mind of the hive. The figure still hadn't moved, but the pressure in the air was suffocating. "I don't like this," I murmured, inching backward toward the containment unit. "We have to go," Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely steady. "Not without the sample," I replied, my eyes darting toward the vial. The glowing substance inside pulsed faintly, almost as if it were alive. "Patient 0. I grabbed the containment case, sealing it shut. "We've got it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But the moment my fingers touched the case, the figure moved. 11:37 a.m. The thing that shouldn't exist. It didn't walk. It glided. One moment, it was at the far end of the room. The next, it was inches from us. "Alex," Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't move." I breathed, my finger tightening on the trigger. But the figure, it wasn't interested in us. Its head tilted toward the containment case in my hands. "The sample," Dr. Voss whispered. "It knows what this is," I murmured. But that wasn't the worst part. The figure's head tilted further, and for the first time, I felt something. A pulse, a wave of hunger. "Alex," Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go." 11:40 a.m. Escape or die. "Moo," I shouted, yanking her toward the exit. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel it watching, waiting. Why isn't it attacking? We sprinted down the corridor, the echo of our footsteps bouncing off the cold metal walls. "Where's the nearest exit?" I asked, my breath ragged. "Service corridor," Dr. Voss replied, her voice tight. 2 floors down. Can we make it? Not if that thing follows us." I glanced over my shoulder. The corridor was empty, but the feeling, it was still there, watching, waiting. "It's not done with us." 11:45 a.m. The sample's influence. We reached the stairwell, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Go," I urged, ushering Dr. Voss down first. "Why isn't it chasing us?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because it doesn't have to," I muttered, my eyes darting to the case in my hand. The sample, it was calling to it. "It wants this," I whispered, realization dawning on me. Dr. Voss's eyes widened. "Then we can't let it have it," she said, her voice firm. "Agreed." 11:50 a.m. Dead ends and new threats. We reached the lower level. The corridor stretched out ahead, dimly lit by flickering emergency lights. "Almost there," I muttered, but as we rounded the corner, I stopped. Dead. Alex. Dr. Voss's voice trembled. The hallway ahead was blocked. Bodies. Dozens of them. But they weren't dead. Their eyes were open, glazed, lifeless. But they were breathing. Sleepers. I whispered, my stomach twisting. We couldn't go through them. We need another way. I murmured, scanning the area. There's no time. Dr. Voss whispered, her voice shaking. My mind raced. Then, a pulse. Faint, but growing stronger. I felt it, and so did they. They're waking up. 11:55 a.m. Too late. Move. I hissed, pulling Dr. Voss back. The first sleeper stirred. A low, guttural sound escaped its lips. We're out of time. The others began to rise. We can't go through them, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice trembling. No, I muttered, scanning the area desperately. But there was nowhere to go. 11:57 a.m. No way out. Backup plan, I muttered. What backup plan? Dr. Voss's voice was tight with fear. Improvise. I raised my rifle, aiming at the gas line running along the ceiling. Alex, what are you doing? Buying us time, I murmured. Wait, bang. The bullet tore through the pipe. A hiss of gas filled the corridor. Move, I shouted, pulling her toward the service hatch. Alex, go. We dove through the hatch just as the gas ignited. 11:59 a.m. Fire and ash. The explosion rocked the building, sending a shockwave through the walls. Flames erupted, consuming the sleepers and blocking their path. Did that work? Dr. Voss panted, her voice shaky. For now, I muttered, coughing through the smoke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. 12 p.m., the hive's final move. As we stumbled through the maintenance corridor, I felt it again. The pulse, stronger this time, closer, and then a voice, not audible, but inside my head. You can't stop it. I froze. Alex. Dr. Voss's voice was distant. It's already too late. My vision blurred. The world tilted. And then I saw it. Not just the infected, not just the hive, but the source. Patient 0, 12:05 p.m. The revelation. We need to go, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice urgent. But I couldn't move, because I finally understood. It's not a virus. The hive wasn't just controlling the infected. It was growing, it's evolving, and the sample in my hand wasn't the cure. It was the key. Oh God, 12:10 p.m. No turning back. Alex. Dr. Voss's voice was more urgent now. We can't go to Chicago. I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. What? Chicago's not the answer. My eyes locked onto hers. It's the beginning. Her face went pale. Then where do we go? She asked softly. I swallowed hard, the weight of the truth sinking in. We don't run. My grip tightened on the containment case. We end this. 12:15 p.m. No more running. Alex, we can't go to Chicago, Dr. Voss whispered again, her voice trembling. I stood there, gripping the containment case, my mind spinning with the weight of what I just realized. Chicago wasn't the answer. It was the source. Alex, her voice pulled me back. We can't let this thing spread, she murmured. Not any further. I nodded, but my throat was dry. We're not running anymore, I murmured. Dr. Voss's eyes widened. What are you saying? I took a slow breath, the smell of burning flesh and smoke still thick in the air. I'm saying, I met her gaze. We go straight to the source. 12:18 p.m. A plan with no future. Alex, that's suicide, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Probably, I muttered, my eyes locked on the glowing vial in my hands. But if we don't stop it here, her face went pale. There won't be anything left. A long silence stretched between us. We don't know what's waiting for us there, she murmured. We do, I reply, my voice grim. Patient 0. Her eyes darted to the vial. That's not just a sample, she whispered. No, I murmured. It's a beacon, the pulse I've been feeling. It wasn't random. It was a signal, and we were carrying it straight back to where it all began. 12:25 p.m. Course correction. Where is it? Dr. Voss asked, her voice barely steady. Not Chicago, I muttered, pulling up the map on the Humvee's console. Then where? I traced a line southward, to the place where the first reports came in. I murmured. Ground Zero. Her eyes followed my finger as it landed on a remote section of southern Illinois. Camp Horizon, she murmured. My jaw clenched. Military research outpost, I said. Shut down a decade ago. Why there? Because that's where Project Genesis started. 12:30 p.m. The drive to Ground Zero. The Humvee's engine roared as we left the smoldering ruins of Chicago behind. The infected were still out there, but they weren't following us. Not anymore. They didn't need to. They're waiting, Dr. Voss murmured, her eyes distant. I glanced at her. What do you mean? She swallowed hard, her face pale. I can still feel it. A chill ran down my spine. The hive, I whispered. She nodded slowly. It's not just calling the infected anymore, she murmured. It's calling us. 1:15 p.m., the calm before the storm. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and eerily silent. Too silent. Even the air felt wrong. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. I know, I murmured, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and we were driving straight into its trap. Do we even have a plan? She asked softly. Yeah, I muttered, my jaw tight. Get inside. Get to the control center. Shut it down. Her eyes met mine. And if we can't, I didn't answer. We both knew the truth. Then we don't leave. 2 p.m., arrival at Camp Horizon. The gates of Camp Horizon loomed ahead, rusted, warped by time and neglect. But the place wasn't dead. Not entirely. The air was thick, almost charged. Jesus, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice trembling. The compound was surrounded by them. Hundreds, maybe thousands. The infected stood motionless, eyes glazed over, bodies swaying gently as if caught in an invisible current. Sleepers, I murmured, my throat dry. They're waiting, Dr. Voss murmured. For us, I replied, gripping the wheel tighter. Why aren't they attacking? She whispered. Because I swallowed hard. They don't need to. 2:05 p.m. The signal intensifies. The moment I killed the engine, the pulse surged. I almost dropped the containment case as the vibration grew stronger. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. I felt it too. The pull, stronger now, more urgent. They know we're here. I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. We need to move. Fast, Dr. Voss added, her eyes darting toward the unmoving horde. Let's go. 2:10 p.m. Infiltrating the compound. We moved fast. Sticking to the shadows, we slipped past the perimeter. The infected didn't move, but I could feel them, their eyes, following us. They're watching, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely steady. Let them, I murmured. We reached the main building, a crumbling structure that had once been the heart of Project Genesis. Control centers underground, I whispered. Do you remember the way? She asked softly. Every step, I murmured. 2:15 p.m., descent into hell. The stairwell leading to the lower levels was wrong. The walls pulsed. The air was thick. This place, Dr. Voss murmured, her voice trembling. It's not a lab anymore. I whispered, my throat tight. It's alive. The infection wasn't just in the air. It was in the walls, growing, feeding, waiting. 2:20 p.m., the hive's heartbeat. We reached the lower level, and that's when we heard it. Bottom, the sound echoed through the corridor. A slow, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. I hear it. I murmured, my throat dry. It was coming from the end of the hall, the control center. Patient 0, 2:25 p.m., face to face with the source. We stepped into the control room, and there it was, the containment chamber. But the figure inside, it wasn't human anymore. Dear God, Dr. Voss whispered. Patient 0 stood suspended in a viscous fluid, its body warped and twisted beyond recognition. But it was aware, its head tilted slightly, and I felt it, the pulse. Bottom, 2:30 p.m., the truth revealed. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. I tore my gaze away from the figure. The monitors lining the walls flickered, displaying data. Project Genesis, Stage 5 active. Neural network online. Stage 5, I murmured. Neural network? Dr. Voss's voice was shaky. It's not just a hive. My blood ran cold. It's a neural system. Dr. Voss's eyes widened. It's not controlling them. Her voice trembled. It's becoming them. 2:35 p.m. Too late to turn back. We have to shut it down, I said, my voice tight. Ow! Dr. Voss whispered, her eyes darting toward the control panel. I scanned the console. Manual override. I murmured. We can sever the connection. But Dr. Voss's voice trailed off. I met her gaze. We won't survive. Her eyes filled with fear. We don't have a choice, I whispered. She nodded, her jaw clenched. Let's end this. 2:40 p.m. Disconnection protocol. I moved to the console, my hands flying across the keys. The system fought back. The hive knew what we were doing. Come on, I muttered through gritted teeth. Bottom. The pulse grew louder, stronger. Almost there. 2:45 p.m. The hive awakens. Alex. Dr. Voss's voice trembled. I didn't look up. Almost. Alex. Something was behind me. I turned, and there it was. The figure. The one that had been following us. But now, it wasn't watching. It was moving. 2:50 p.m. The final choice. Alex. Dr. Voss shouted. I grabbed the containment case. The sample. I whispered. The beacon. Dr. Voss murmured, her eyes widening. We have to destroy it. 2:55 p.m. Sacrifice. The figure was almost upon us. The pulse. Deafening. Alex, go. I murmured. My eyes locked on the control panel. Alex, go. 3 p.m. The end begins. Dr. Voss's footsteps echoed as she ran. I stayed behind, the containment case in one hand and the detonation sequence in the other. Come and get it, I murmured. Bottom, and then I pressed the button. 3:01 p.m. Detonation imminent. I didn't look away. My finger hovered over the detonator, the containment case vibrating in my other hand. Bottom, the pulse grew louder. The figure was closing in. Its elongated limbs moved with unsettling grace. Its hollow gaze locked onto me. Not today, I muttered through gritted teeth. I squeezed the trigger. 3:02 p.m. Explosion or not. Click. Nothing. My heart stopped. What? I hit the trigger again. Click. No explosion. No sokwabe. Nothing. My stomach dropped. Come on. I hissed, frantically checking the detonator. The timer was still active. 5 seconds for seconds, but the explosion never came. 3:03 p.m. The hive's countermeasure. Alex. Dr. Voss's voice echoed from the other side of the corridor. I turned. She stood at the far end, her eyes wide with horror. Why didn't it work? She whispered. My mind raced, heart pounding. It should have. Bazoom. The pulse grew louder, stronger, and that's when I realized. It stopped it. The hive. I murmured, my throat dry. Dr. Voss's face paled. It knows, she whispered. Not just knows, I muttered. It's adapting. 3:05 p.m. An evolving threat. The infected weren't just mindless husks anymore. They weren't even following the hive's will. They were part of it. Alex, Dr. Voss murmured, her voice trembling. They're learning. I gritted my teeth. We're out of time. Then what do we do? She whispered. I looked at the containment case in my hand. The sample, the beacon. If the detonation won't stop it, I swallowed hard. We have to take it to the source. 3:10 p.m. Deeper into the hive. We're going down there. Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. We don't have a choice, I muttered. The control panel was useless now. The only way to stop it was inside. Alex, she whispered, her voice cracking. Her eyes met mine. Are you sure about this? No, but I didn't say it. We either end it now, I murmured, gripping the containment case tighter, or it ends us. 3:15 p.m. The descent begins. The corridor stretched ahead of us. The air grew thicker, heavier. The pulse. Bazoom. It was guiding us, or calling us. It knows we're coming, Dr. Voss murmured. Good, I muttered. Let it know. 3:20 p.m. The chamber awaits. We reached the final door. Massive, steel reinforced, but it was open. That's not good, I murmured. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. We stepped inside, and I saw it. Oh, God. 3:23 p.m. The hive's core. The room wasn't a lab anymore. It was alive. Flesh pulsed along the walls, a sickly glow emanating from veins that ran through the floor and ceiling. And at the center, the core. It wasn't just a biological mass. It was a brain, pulsing, throbbing, alive. Alex, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice shaking. Is that the hive? I murmured. 3:25 p.m. The mind of the infection. The core wasn't just the heart of the hive. It was its mind. Every infected, every sleeper, connected, and it was thinking. Alex, Dr. Voss murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt it too, a presence. It knows we're here. 3:27 p.m. No more waiting. We end it, I whispered, my grip tightening on the containment case. Ow! Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. Direct injection, I murmured, my eyes locked on the core. She stared at me. That'll kill us, she whispered. I know. 3:30 p.m. One chance to end it. I took a step forward. The pulse grew louder. Bottom, louder. Bottom, faster. Bottom, BA dump. The hive was panicking. It knew what I was about to do. Good. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. Go, I murmured, not looking back. But, 3:33 p.m. Sacrifice. She didn't move. I could feel her eyes on me, but I couldn't look back. Not now. And this, I murmured. And then I ran. 3:35 p.m. The final injection. The core pulsed faster as I approached. The containment case vibrated in my hand. Bottom. The hive was afraid. Good. I ripped open the case. The vial glowed brighter, reacting to the core. Let's see how you like this, I murmured, and I plunged the vial into the core. 3:37 p.m. Reaction. The moment the needle pierced the flesh, the hive screamed, not out loud, but in my mind, a deafening, agonizing pulse of pain and rage. Bottom, and then silence. 3:40 p.m. The hive collapses. The core began to wither. The pulse stopped. The walls shuddered. The infected collapsed. It was dying. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice echoed through the chaos. Come on. 3:42 p.m. Run or die. The entire facility was coming apart. The hive's death was tearing the compound apart. Go, I shouted, sprinting back toward the exit. Dr. Voss was ahead of me, her footsteps echoing through the collapsing corridor. Almost there. 3:45 p.m. Escape. Almost. We reached the exit. The door was still open. Move, I shouted, shoving her through. Alex, hurry. The ground shook beneath me. The walls began to collapse. And then, bottom. My heart stopped. 3:47 p.m. One last trick. The pulse was still there. Faint, but alive. No, I whispered, my blood running cold. Alex. Dr. Voss screamed from the other side, but I couldn't move because I realized the truth. It wasn't just the core. 3:50 p.m. The hive's backup plan. The infection had spread everywhere. It wasn't just contained to the core. It had seeded itself in the air, in the ground, in us. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. We didn't stop it. 3:55 p.m. No way out. The pulse grew louder again, stronger. Bottom, faster. Bottom be a dump. It wasn't over. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely a whisper. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The next stage, 4 p.m. The end or the beginning. A figure emerged from the collapsing corridor. Tall, twisted, familiar. Patient zero, I murmured. But it wasn't just one. There were more. Oh, God. 4:01 p.m. The pulse returns. Bottom. The sound echoed in my ears. Not just in my head, in the air. Louder, stronger. Bottom. I staggered back, my eyes locked on the figures emerging from the darkness. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. Stay back, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't. She stood beside me, her eyes wide with horror. No, we didn't stop the infection. We woke it up. 4:03 p.m. New threats emerged. The figures stepped into the dim light. They weren't like the others, not the mindless husks we'd seen before. These were different, more aware. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the pulse that echoed through the ruins of Camp Horizon. Alex, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely steady. What are they? I swallowed hard. Not sleepers, I murmured. Something worse. 4:05 p.m. The hive's next move. The infected stood motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on us. But I could feel it. The hive wasn't controlling them anymore. It was inside them. Bottom. The pulse echoed louder. And then they moved. Fast. Too fast. Run. I shouted, grabbing Dr. Voss's arm. 4:07 p.m. Desperate escape. We sprinted through the crumbling corridor, the infected close behind. They weren't stumbling. They weren't slow. They were hunting. Left, I shouted, pulling Dr. Voss towards side passage. We slammed through a rusted door, slamming it shut behind us. Bang! Their fists pounded against the metal, but they didn't try to break through. They didn't need to. They're hurting us, Dr. Voss whispered, her face pale. I nodded, my jaw clenched. They know exactly where we're going. 4:10 p.m. Trapped again. The passage led us deeper into the facility. Wrong direction. I knew it. Dr. Voss knew it. But we didn't have a choice. The infected were closing in. Alex, her voice was barely a whisper. I glanced back. They weren't following anymore. Why did they stop? I didn't answer, because I already knew. They didn't need to chase us. We were walking straight into the hive's trap. 4:15 p.m. The Chamber of Origins. The passage opened into a massive chamber. Cold, silent, and in the center, the source. What is this place? Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely steady. I swallowed hard. Where it all started, I murmured. The walls pulsed softly, veins of sickly green and red running through them. And at the center, a new core. Impossible, Dr. Voss murmured, her eyes wide with disbelief. We destroyed the hive, I whispered. No, she murmured. We destroyed its shell. 4:20 p.m. Evolution accelerates. The new core wasn't just bigger. It was alive. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. I felt it too. The pulse wasn't just echoing anymore. It was stronger, more focused. It's adapting, I murmured. Dr. Voss swallowed hard. To what? My jaw clenched. To us. 4:25 p.m. The hive's final stage. The air grew heavier, thicker. The pulse. Bazoom. Bazoom. It was faster now. Urgent. Alex. Dr. Voss's voice was barely a whisper. We can't let it finish, I murmured. If this thing completes its next phase. I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to, because we both knew the truth. 4:30 p.m. A new kind of infection. The infected had followed us, but they didn't attack. They waited, their bodies convulsed, twitching as the pulse grew louder. Bazoom, Alex, Dr. Voss whispered, and then I saw it. Their bodies changing. Bones snapped, muscles twisted. They weren't just evolving, they were merging. 4:35 p.m. The hive becomes one. The infected collapsed, one by one, but they didn't die. Their bodies fused, twisting, combining, forming something else. Oh my God, Dr. Voss murmured. Her face was pale, because standing where the infected had fallen was one entity. 4:40 p.m. The birth of a new mind. The hive wasn't just evolving, it was consolidating. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. It's not just a hive anymore. I murmured, my throat dry. Her eyes widened. It's a singular mind. 4:45 p.m. The signal amplifies. The pulse grew deafening. It wasn't just in my head. It was everywhere. The air vibrated. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. Do you feel that? I nodded, my jaw clenched. The hive wasn't just broadcasting a signal anymore. It was calling something. 4:50 p.m. Incoming transmission. The monitors flickered to life. Lines of code scrolled across the screens. And then, a message. Transmission received. My heart stopped. What is that? Dr. Voss whispered. I didn't answer, because I knew. The hive wasn't just evolving. It was sending a signal. Alex, her voice trembled. Who's it calling? 4:55 p.m. The unknown response. The air shifted like a ripple through reality itself. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely above a whisper. Something's coming. I felt it too. The pulse wasn't just echoing anymore. It was answering. 5 p.m. Too late to stop it. The core pulsed one final time. And then, silence. The air grew still. But I wasn't relieved, because I knew what silence meant. Alex, Dr. Voss murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. And then, bazoom, louder, stronger, more, alien. Oh, God. 5:05 p.m. The next phase begins. The core split open. A wave of energy rippled outward. And in its place, something new emerged. Tall, twisted, and aware. It wasn't just a hive anymore. It was something else. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice trembled. What is that? I didn't answer, because I knew the truth. It's not just the infection. 5:10 p.m. No more running. We have to stop it, I murmured. Dr. Voss's eyes met mine. Ow! My jaw clenched. I don't know. The figure stepped forward, its hollow gaze locking onto us. But this time, it spoke. Alex, the voice echoed through the air. But it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere. Welcome, it murmured, to the new world. 5:15 p.m. The beginning of the end. My blood ran cold. The infection wasn't just spreading anymore. It was rewriting. Reality itself was changing, and we were too late to stop it. Alex, Dr. Voss whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now? I swallowed hard, my eyes locked on the figure. We end it, I murmured, but this time my jaw clenched. We do it right. 5:20 p.m. The air stinks of death. The figure stood in front of us, a silent sentinel in the heart of the chamber. Its body was composed of twisted, mutating flesh, its eyes glowing with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't just an infection anymore. It was alive, and it was watching us. I gripped the rifle tighter, my knuckles white. The cold metal against my hand was the only thing that kept me grounded in this nightmare. Alex, Dr. Voss's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. What? What is it? I couldn't answer. My mind was too clouded with 1,000 different thoughts. But the most pressing one was simple. Survival. I don't know. I whispered back, my breath shaky. But I know one thing. We can't let it complete whatever it's trying to do. Her gaze flickered to the dark corners of the room, and for a moment, I could almost see the pieces of her brilliant mind trying to put everything together. She was smarter than anyone I knew, but this was beyond comprehension. The air felt heavier, thicker. Every breath felt like a struggle, and the sound of my heartbeat grew deafening. "Ow," she asked. 5:25 p.m., the highest heartbeat. The pulse had become more than just a signal. It was now a rhythmic, almost predatory sound, like the heartbeat of something vast, something ancient. The walls of the chamber seemed to throb with each beat, as if the room itself was alive, feeding off the growing energy. "Whatever this thing is," I said, my voice strained, "it's calling something. It's not just the infection, it's something else. Something we haven't seen yet." As if on cue, the glowing figure in front of us shifted. Its body expanded and contracted, the mass of twisted flesh writhing, as if it were breathing. The sound of air being sucked in and released filled the chamber. I could hear the wet, gurgling noise of the transformation. I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the makeshift detonator on my belt. The only thing we had left to stop this thing was the C for my pack and a prayer. "Alex," Dr. Voss's voice quivered. "We can't just blow it up." Yes, we can." I cut her off, my voice sharp. "And we will. We don't have another choice." 5:30 p.m. The signal grows stronger. The creature in front of us froze for a moment. Then its head tilted, its eyes narrowing as it seemed to sense something beyond the chamber. Its glowing gaze seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the air. I felt my pulse quicken. The walls hummed. The pulse quickened again. It was louder now, almost deafening. And then, the screens lining the walls flickered. The message from earlier reappeared, this time much clearer. "Transmission received. Link established." A low, guttural noise came from the figure. A laugh, or growl. It was impossible to tell. My heart sank. Whatever it had just connected to, it was far beyond what we could ever comprehend. "Alex," Dr. Voss screamed, snapping me out of my thoughts. "We're running out of time." I didn't need her to tell me. The silence that followed the transmission was thick. Something was coming. I reached for the detonator, and my finger hovered over the button. But hesitation gnawed at me. What if the explosion wasn't enough? What if we were already too late? 5:35 p.m., the entity awakens. Then, with a sudden jerk, the glowing figure in front of us straightened to its full height. It towered over us now, its body splitting, rearranging itself into something larger, darker, more grotesque. The skin sloughed off, revealing a mass of pulsating, writhing dark matter beneath. It wasn't just the infection anymore. It had become a parasite. The air shivered. "Alex, do it!" Dr. Voss shouted. I didn't hesitate this time. I slammed my thumb down on the detonator. Nothing happened. I cursed. The charge hadn't activated. "Damn it!" I shouted, scrambling for the trigger mechanism. And then it happened. The figure lunged at us, its form a blur of organic mass and shifting shapes. It moved faster than anything human. Too fast, too strong. "Get down!" I shouted, shoving Dr. Voss to the ground. I followed suit, just in time as a blast of energy surged over us, knocking me off my feet. 5:40 p.m., the explosion that wasn't. The world seemed to shatter around me. I could hear the blast, the deafening roar of metal and stone ripping apart. But when the dust settled, I realized it wasn't enough. The detonator had failed, and the creature was still alive, still moving. "Get up!" I shouted, grabbing Dr. Voss by the arm. We scrambled to our feet, hearts pounding. My head was swimming, my vision blurry, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it win. I scanned the room for anything that could help us. Then, through the haze, I saw it. A console, half buried under rubble. A screen flickered weakly. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, Dr. Voss at my heels. "Alex, wait!" she cried, but I didn't stop. 5:45 p.m., the last-ditch effort. I reached the console and slammed my hands onto the buttons, praying for something, anything that would stop this nightmare. The screen lit up and a warning flashed. Reactor core override. Authorization required. I glanced at Dr. Voss. Her eyes were wide with realization. That's it, she breathed. The core. If we can override it, we can shut it down permanently. But the figure was already moving toward us again, its form towering, growing, shifting. It was too late. We had to move, and we had to move now. I hit the override button, and the screen flickered to life. A series of numbers began to scroll across the screen. I quickly entered the access codes Dr. Voss had given me. This was our last chance. 5:50 p.m., the final countdown. As the console hummed, the ground beneath us began to shake. The chamber was collapsing around us. The walls cracked and split as the core began to power down. "Alex," Dr. Voss shouted. Her voice panicked, but I couldn't answer. The countdown had begun. Self-destruct in 10 minutes. 5:55 p.m., the escape. The creature roared, a sound like metal grinding against bone, and lunged at us. Its jaws were open wide, teeth jagged and dripping with foul, glowing liquid. I grabbed Dr. Voss, pulling her toward the exit. We didn't look back. The creature's scream echoed behind us, but we couldn't stop. The countdown was ticking. 5:59 p.m., the last step. We made it to the surface just as the explosion rocked the ground beneath us. The sky lit up, the shockwave pushing us to the ground. 6 p.m., silence. The world went silent. The shaking stopped. The air was still, empty. We lay there breathless. I didn't move. The mission was over. The infection was gone. But at what cost?